So should I be using SST or should I be using CDK? In this video, we'll take a look. Let's get started. So a little bit of context here. CDK is a way for you to define the infrastructure on AWS using normal sort of programming languages. So you can use TypeScript, JavaScript, Java, C#, etc., to create the infrastructure that you want on AWS. SST, on the other hand, is a full stack application framework that lets you build applications on AWS. So you can define your infrastructure, you can write your application code, connect that up with your front end, deploy that all together to AWS. The part where you define the infrastructure uses what's known as sort of higher level CDK constructs to basically deploy your application. So in some ways, SST is built on CDK. And so if you happen to be familiar with AWS and CDK, or if you've heard about CDK and you're hearing about SST for the first time, you might be wondering, why do I have to use SST? Why don't I just use CDK directly? And there are a few key sort of differences here that we'll look at in this video. But the big one really is that CDK is a way for you to create infrastructure, whereas SST is a full stack application framework. It's similar in some ways to the Rails or the Django's of the world if they were built natively for the cloud, as in they helped you with more than just application code, they helped you with deployment as well. Now you might be wondering, what does sort of full stack application framework for the cloud really sort of mean? And let me give you a little bit of what that sort of looks like in the SST world. A key thing, and if you've heard of SST or if you've heard of some of our videos before, is that we help you with local development. A big part of building applications on the cloud is the ability to sort of test them as you would with traditional applications. And it's a little bit trickier here because your applications are deployed to the cloud. And so being able to sort of test them in the cloud happens to be a little bit different. To fix this, with SST, we created this thing called live Lambda development. And the way it works is that you run the SST start command. This deploys your application into AWS. And then when a Lambda function, this is your application code, when it gets invoked in AWS, that gets proxied to your local machine where you're able to sort of set breakpoints, make changes to it just as you would with any sort of traditional application. And so this really makes it possible for you to build applications effectively natively on the cloud. Now, CDK, on the other hand, when CDK was first sort of created, its primary purpose was just with helping you with infrastructure. Over time, the community sort of realized that, hey, I'm writing Lambda code as well. Can you help me sort of test this? And so CDK created what is known as sort of the CDK watch command. And this was added a little bit later, but the way this effectively works is every time basically it watches for changes that you're making in the Lambda code that goes along with the rest of your CDK infrastructure. And every time it notices a change, it'll redeploy or it'll re-upload those changes to AWS. The difference obviously here is that, that can take sort of seconds and you're not able to set sort of breakpoints, and the developer experience is a little bit disjointed because you're effectively waiting for these changes to sort of show up in AWS. So that's sort of one part of it, is that the local development environment is built for developers in some ways in SST. Another thing that we do, and I sort of mentioned this at the beginning, is we help you kind of tie your infrastructure, your application code, and your front-end code together. Let's look at an example of what that sort of looks like or what that sort of feels like. In SST, we have this concept of config, and this is basically a way for you to set secrets and parameters for your entire application. Let's look at an example in terms of code. Here we're defining a new config parameter, and it is the topic name. So it's an SNS topic, and it's that topic name is our config parameter. This is defined on the infrastructure side. We then tell SST that we have a function that needs to be able to access that config parameter. This is, again, still on the infrastructure side. But then when we pop over to our application code or that Lambda function, we're able to import a specific Lambda helper. And this now is able to pull up that config parameter that we'd set in our infrastructure. And so you can kind of see how the application code that you're writing is connected to the infrastructure that you're creating. We do something similar for the front end as well, and I'll show you kind of a code snippet for that too. Here we're defining a Vite static site. So this is basically deploying a React application into AWS. You're able to do things like set the custom domain or specify the path of where your front-end application is in your project directory. But a neat thing that you can do is you're able to pass in an environment variable. In this specific example, we're grabbing the API URL from our backend, and we're putting that or injecting that into our front end. And so on our front end side, we don't have to hard code these API endpoints. We're just able to sort of dynamically access them effectively. So another sort of example of how SST kind of ties, your sort of full stack application together. A couple of other things that sort of SST helps you with on the full stack application side, one of them being sort of testing. So we piggyback on the config concept. So now you've got these, configs that you've sort of defined centrally for your application. And what you want to do is you want to run your tests against those parameters that have been defined. And so SST has this neat little load config CLI that'll load up effectively the config, pipe that into your tests, and now your tests run against the config parameters that your application is just normally sort of used to. To round out essentially the sort of full stack application development framework, one of the things that we kind of do is we help you with writing migrations for your database. So you have a command that you can run to scaffold a new migration. You can then write out your migration as you normally sort of would. And we give you this neat little web console where you can go and run your migrations, or you can roll them back. You can also sort of query your database and whatnot. But just again, sort of a sampling of the full sort of suite of things that SST does when it comes to application development. Whereas again, sort of going back, CDK on the other hand is more for defining infrastructure. To round this out, I thought I'd show you really quickly just a couple of examples of what it actually looks like when you look at sort of SST code and CDK code. When we had created SST, our focus very clearly was this is going to be for full stack developers. And so we want to make sure that the language and the primitives that you sort of use feel comfortable and fun and sort of easy to use as a developer. And this really shows up when you actually just sort of look at what SST infrastructure code looks like in comparison to what I would sort of call raw CDK code. We've got a sort of simple example here. This is a CRUD API backed by a DynamoDB table. This is the infrastructure definition for that. So in the case of SST, we're creating a table, we're creating an API, we're defining our CRUD routes here. So there are sort of 5 of these. And then we're saying that all of our these sort of routes or the API as a whole needs to know what the name of the table is that it's going to be doing these operations against. And then finally we say, hey, my API needs access to my table, or rather it needs to have permissions to be able to access my table. And that's it. The sort of infrastructure definition, fits in sort of one page. Really what we're using is an API construct. The stack context is sort of not necessarily tied to this example, but you've got kind of the table construct that we're using. And that is literally just sort of powering our CRUD API. I'll flip over to the CDK example, and CDK sort of has a version of how you would do kind of a CRUD API as well. Right off the top, you'll notice just the sort of number of imports that we have. And it's not just kind of the number or the sort of the fact that it's a little verbose. It's the fact that these specific imports are AWS specific resources. So again, if I sort of go back to the premise of this argument in some ways, it is that CDK is meant for folks that are familiar with AWS and familiar with the resources that they are creating in AWS, or the sort of like bits and pieces of those resources that they're creating in AWS. If you actually just look at the code itself, you've got sort of a familiar sort of table definition, just like we kind of did there. You then, and this one's a little bit different here, is that you have to define these function props. And this is because, you have a bunch of different functions. So for each CRUD action, you are defining the function, the Lambda function that you need, and then you're passing in these props. These props are sort of shared across these functions. So, it's been sort of pulled out here. But what you're sort of seeing here is you're defining each function by hand. In comparison, that's not something that we were doing in the SST case. You then have to go in and grant permissions to each of those sort of functions specifically. So there are 5 of them again. And then you're creating what's known as a Lambda integration. This is eventually what's going to allow you to connect a Lambda function to an API gateway. So you have to do 5 of them. And then you get to create the actual API gateway infrastructure. And then you connect those integrations for the routes that you're looking for to the API gateway instance. And then you're defining sort of cores for those as well. And then you can kind of see like the cores definition is sort of done by hand as well. There are 2 big differences here, aside from the fact that the CDK sort of example is a lot more verbose. It's that SST is obviously, some of that is not coming for free. SST is sort of creating these higher level constructs for you, but they are designed with sort of developers in mind, developers that are not necessarily AWS experts. So the idea here is you're coming in, you're looking for, as I was sort of mentioning before, you're looking for an API, you're looking for a table, and you're looking for familiar ways to sort of define them. And so SST code just ends up being a lot more pleasant to sort of work with. That said, we do have an escape hatch. If you end up needing some of these other options, you can sort of drop down to sort of CDK level. But that's, in effect, the crux of the argument, being that SST is for application developers that are looking to build full stack applications on AWS, whereas CDK is for folks that are looking to define infrastructure. It does have some things that can help you with the application code side, like the CDK watch command that I mentioned. But in reality, you are a little bit on your own when it comes to sort of figuring some of this out. And there you have it. Hopefully you found this video sort of helpful. If you've got any questions, feel free to sort of pop into our Discord, leave a comment, or let us know if there's something else that we should be looking to cover. Thank you.